Hello, and thank you for joining today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar titled How to Monetize Your Energy Assets with Grid Services, sponsored by Enel X. My name is Jessica Hunt, and I am the Director of Live Events for E&E Leader. Before we get started with the presentation, I want to go over a few housekeeping items with all attendees. Please reference the Help widget at the bottom of your screen if you are experiencing any technical difficulties. If you are still having issues after performing the steps listed, please send a message to me using the Q&A widget, which is already open on the top right part of your screen. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's event. So if you have questions for today's speaker, please submit during the course of this presentation. If we do not get a chance to answer your specific question during today's event, the speaker or a member of their team will follow up with you as soon as possible. Please also take notice of the variety of widgets at the bottom of the console. Enel X is gracious enough to provide numerous resources for everyone attending. If you happen to be a frequent webinar attendee, you may notice some changes to our console. You can now chat via the group chat widget, as well as send tweets to your network. Please include the hashtag provided to share the event with your peers. As always, we love to receive feedback regarding the topic and presentation, so thank you in advance for completing the survey at the bottom of your screen. Joining us today from Enel X is Steve Dormus. He is the Director of Grid Services for Enel X North America. In this role, he is responsible for developing new products and solutions for customers seeking to leverage Enel X's full suite of expertise and capabilities in North American energy markets to fully monetize their renewable and DER assets. Steve graduated with an MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management in 2012. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to him. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, for the introduction. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Steve Dormus with Enel X. And I just want to first, before we begin, thank the Environment and Energy Leader for hosting the webinar today, and obviously for everybody on the call. I know we have quite a few of you for taking the next 45 to 60 minutes out of your day to talk about grid services and what it is. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So today's agenda will cover three main topics. First, we'll set the stage for why this is a relevant time to be talking about grid services in the context of what's happening on the grid and what's changing on the grid. Second, we'll talk about and review what we actually mean by the term grid services and the opportunity that it presents. And then finally, think about how you take advantage of the opportunity. And in the end, we'll leave some time for some Q&A. So let's dive right in. And so before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to quickly give an overview of Enel X and what we do, just to provide a little bit of context to explain why I'm here talking to you all today about grid services. So Enel X is a part of Enel, which is one of the largest utilities in the world. Enel is based in Italy, and Enel X was formed partially as a recognition of the change in the energy landscape that we'll talk about today, really with a focus of providing a suite of offerings and solutions to help enable that energy transformation that we're witnessing, and really with an emphasis on the demand side and the customer side, and innovation around demand side flexibility. And so in North America specifically, Enel X was created primarily through a couple of acquisitions. One was Enernoc, so they were a leader in demand response, procurement advisory services. Enel acquired Demand Energy Networks, which is a leader in battery storage controls, optimization software, and then finally eMotorworks, which is a leader in EV chargers and monetizing EVs in the energy markets. And so the combination of those three businesses in North America were brought together, and that formed Enel X. And so that built the foundation for what we're doing today, and had a particular, those groups coming together had a particularly unique set of expertise in understanding how the energy assets that exist on the demand side can interact with the grid, and helping them, helping businesses find creative ways to make money. So that's a quick overview of Enel. Let's dive. All right, so we'll start with providing an overview of some key themes and trends that we think are important to highlight to help put the grid services opportunity in context. So first, the energy sector is evolving. There are what we view as 4 broad themes that I think encapsulate some of the major changes going on in the industry. This won't be news to many, but I'll quickly walk through each of them. So the first is decarbonization. We're finally at a point in history where there's fairly broad science-based consensus that regarding the drivers of climate change and the resulting forecast of what that means to us as a society and the need to really aggressively decarbonize the economy as quickly as possible. The Paris Agreement, that's an important driver on a global level, and even in the United States, more and more states have some form of renewable mandate. So increasingly, decarbonization is happening across all aspects of the electricity sector. The second is electrification. So at the same time that we're decarbonizing the economy, we're also electrifying more and more of it. Particularly in the transportation sector, that's where you see the most change of converting the energy source to electricity. The number of electric vehicle models is increasing every year, and electric vehicles are extending from not only just passenger cars, but to buses, delivery vans, trucks, and other fleets. And so with that electrification of the transportation sector, as well as other parts of the economy, that's going to lead to more and more electrification broadly and demand on the grid. And so third is decentralization. So more and more now, more than ever, energy assets are distributed versus centralized. You see this in community solar projects that are popping up, backup generators that are being refurbished with better emission controls, battery systems, among others. So there's a lot of these customer-sited or non-large utility scale power plants that are popping up all over the United States. And so overall, what was traditionally a supply side only grid is increasingly being penetrated by both smaller distributed supply and as well as demand side flexibility. And then last is adoption. So I think there's sometimes a perception among non-energy industry, the public from outside the industry, that renewables and batteries have been being discussed for the past 50 years, but nothing's really changed. But as we all know, it actually is changing right now. There's never been a higher amount of market competition, demand, general learnings, and that's really driving down costs across both renewables and batteries. And so this is opening up more and more market segments where the costs are getting to a point to being competitive, and even in some cases at parity with other resource types. And so those are only going to continue to decline, and we'll see a commensurate increase in adoption. And so on the macro level, this is the evolution that we're seeing. It's ultimately driven by 2 main things. One is technology advancements, and 2 is decreasing cost of renewables. And so the interaction of all these dynamics, these 4 broad trends, makes for a very unique set of challenges for grid operators. And we've now reached the tipping point of it all coming together. So we just discussed the macro trends, but let's also quickly walk through other stakeholders that are driving this and see what the data shows. So first of all the trends we've shown, that results in businesses increasingly getting involved. On the left-hand side, we're showing large-scale renewable energy deals over the past 5 years. There are now 235 companies in the RE100, which is a group of businesses committed to going 100% renewable. There are obviously countless more with general sustainability targets and internal commitments to procure more and more renewable electricity to cover their operations. And so contracting with renewable energy projects started with some of the biggest companies in the US, but increasingly smaller companies are getting involved. And as you can see from the chart on the left-hand side, the growth has really been exponential over the past few years, with over 15 gigawatts of renewable capacity being procured in 2018 and 2019. And as we discussed on the last slide, costs on battery assets continue to decline, which is driving increasing behind-the-meter battery deployments. We're still in the early stages of this particular market segment, but the growth rates are very high. And there obviously are many other trends that would show similar up and to the right data points. And so, you'll notice here on the left-hand side, we're talking about large-scale front-of-the-meter projects, whereas the chart on the right are relatively smaller behind-the-meter projects, and that's something more we'll discuss later on. But both front-of-the-meter and behind-the-meter are important components of how we think about grid services. Another key stakeholder in the energy space is obviously investors. Many people are familiar with SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which helps make reporting that is done by companies on their ESG factors just more standardized and allows investors to view things on an apples-to-apples basis. Over time, more and more focus has been placed on ESG. There's more money getting poured into companies that focus on this. There's data around companies that focus on ESG outperform those that don't. And it's all culminating in a fairly dramatic shift by institutional investors who are becoming increasingly concerned about a company's exposure to climate change risk. So the most prominent example of this earlier this year, was BlackRock. BlackRock manages $6.5 trillion of assets, and their CEO, Larry Fink, came out in January essentially saying that climate risk creates investment risk, and that will help inform how they think about allocating capital across their funds. And so it was a big deal, and it really, I think, set the tone for how investors are thinking about sustainability as they evaluate companies, and therefore will have cascading effects on how companies react to that. And so even for non-public companies, there's a focus on this. There's a focus on Scope 3 emissions. So if you supply a business that cares about this, it's all going to become increasingly relevant. And so we talked about, companies, your competitors are focused on this, investors are focused on this. And lastly, one of the major stakeholders is employees want to work for companies that value sustainability. The millennial generation is becoming a significant percentage of the workforce, and the majority of them believe that in the need to transition to more sustainable energy. So, from a talent perspective, it's imperative that companies have plans to address sustainability in their own operations. And you can see from these charts, over 40% of millennials said it's influenced the company they chose to work for, and over 75% said it would, focus on sustainability would influence retention. So it really shouldn't go unnoticed. It's really hitting all three key sectors across, the companies themselves and the competition, investors, and the talent pool that's out there. And so, every day we see real-time events confirming the trends we just talked about. You hear Microsoft talking about going carbon negative. There's proof points that companies that focus on sustainability perform better financially, like we talked about, and we know, they're doing this because it's good for their employees, it's good for their shareholders, and ultimately good for their customer base. And so, the articles here are really just a sliver, a snapshot of the articles covering the topic, but it's becoming pretty clear that we're kind of all actively experiencing this energy transition that's underway. And so where does all this change and unique circumstances lead us? So that's really back to the point of this webinar. Your business is going to have to get into the energy game. All the trends that we just talked about point in this direction. You're probably already you're already actively participating. And if you're not, you soon will be. And so the question is, what does that all mean for you? How will you react to these trends? How will you react to the opportunities that result from it? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this webinar talking about. So now let's move to talking about when we say grid services, what do we actually mean by that? And how does that relate to increasing the business-based participation in the energy markets that we just discussed? So the next set of slides will kind of really center around three key aspects of grid services, and these are themes that will keep popping up throughout the slides, which are 1, assets, 2, markets, and 3, value streams. So assets, markets, and value streams, and those will be words and themes that you hear continuously throughout, and we'll talk about how how assets, markets, and value streams interrelate to each other and interact with each other. And so when we talk about the grid services opportunity, it's important to first talk about, I think, the grid itself and how that's evolving. And so the traditional power grid has been around for over 100 years, and it really hasn't changed that much fundamentally over that time. And it was built on a centralized model. And this says today's grid, but maybe you could really view it as today minus a couple of years ago grid, because I think today is really where the change is happening. And so the grid, the way it was traditionally organized, was built on the centralized model. So large power plants were built. That power was sent wholesale via high voltage transmission lines. You could think of those as the arteries of the system. Sent down to lower voltage distribution lines. You could think of those as the veins of the system, and then ultimately consumed by the retail end user, which are businesses, residential. And everything was done in real time, perfectly balancing supply and demand. Demand was relatively predictable, temperature dependent. So in the summer when the temperature was high, grid demand would commensurately increase. And operators that controlled this all had a well-built model for how to handle that. That was the traditional grid, and I think really what we're seeing is a shift to how these components interact. So you still have the same fundamental building blocks, but the way different aspects of the grid interrelate with each other is changing. And so end-use customers are increasingly becoming a player. They're increasingly cognizant about what drives their electricity costs. They could be shifting consumption to reflect different time of use rates. So, when it's higher priced at a given point in time, they could be reducing demand. They could have solar panels on their roofs. They could have batteries on site. The demand side is becoming more and more controlled, but also less predictable. At the top of these slides, the traditional large-scale power producers, you're now seeing large-scale renewables compete alongside the traditional players of coal, nuclear, natural gas. And so really what was previously what you could think of as a producer-consumer model, where power plants produced and businesses and residences consumed, is now a producer-prosumer model, or where the consumers have shifted to both producers and consumers. And so it's the interplay among all of these factors that has really made the grid a lot more dynamic than it's ever been. And so now we're going to talk about what that means and where grid services fits into that. So as mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about 3 primary things: markets, assets, and value streams. And so first we'll talk about markets. In the United States, at a high level, there are generally 2 types of markets: regulated and deregulated. So in regulated markets, that's really the gray area on the map shown on this slide. Utilities are vertically integrated. They control all aspects of the value chain. So they control generation, they control distribution through the poles and wires, and then ultimately managing the retail arrangements at the end-use sites and supplying load. On the other hand, there's deregulated markets as well, and those emerged over the past 20 plus years or so as a way to kind of increase competition, break up that utility monopoly, and allow competition to produce generation at the lowest cost. So there's 9 different ISOs and RTOs in North America, which are basically regional transmission organizations, independent system operators. They're independent bodies that oversee the operation of the grid across multiple states, a relatively large geographic footprint. And the reason we draw this distinction is because when you think about markets and the associated products that they have in those markets to ensure efficiency and cost competitive outcomes, those deregulated markets are where there's been rules created to really enable the demand side to participate alongside the supply side. And so when you think about the slide we showed previously and the changes evolving in the electricity sector, deregulated markets provide a little bit more of a better opportunity to take advantage of those trends, and that's where a lot of the examples we'll talk about today come from. It's important to note, though, that each of these RTOs and ISOs are all slightly different. The rules for participation are nuanced and complex. These are all regulated bodies by FERC, and so there, you see changes and market changes happening all the time. The upheaval we talked about earlier is on full display. So there's rules around leveling the playing field for storage to participate. Now that storage is becoming a more meaningful part of the market. That's FERC Order 841. There's a bunch of rule changes currently happening as we speak about trying to remove the effects of policies and incentives from the market. When an auction takes place, that sets a market price, trying to make sure that that clearing price from the auction is not distorted from non-competitive revenue streams. And so the markets can become quickly very complex, and the rules of engagement of how you participate in those energy markets varies. There's different sets of rules depending on the assets you're talking about, local regulations, different market participants. And layered on top of all of that are different incentives across the geography. So, some different state and federal programs that exist, ITC, the investment tax credit, for CapEx deployed on renewable projects. California has SGIP, which is a program to incentivize storage in California, and then SMART in Massachusetts to incentivize solar development. Just a couple of examples, but overall these markets are dynamic. They're changing, and the rules have slight variations across each of them. So moving on to our second theme of assets, what we have here is a graphic depiction of what you might consider an energy transition manufacturing plant and what that would look like. It has multiple assets that could be leveraged in the energy market. So first, they might have some rooftop solar. They are helping to offset grid usage during the day by generating electricity from solar. That solar could be stored in an energy storage system, a battery, which they could discharge and charge throughout the day or night based on various local needs or grid needs. They're going to have on-site assets, traditional assets that are used to run their core business. And as you think about flexibility for operational assets, there's, I think, 2 core buckets and ways to segment those. What we consider critical versus curtailable. So critical means, under no circumstances could those assets' normal operations be altered. But curtailable means that those assets could either stop using energy or reduce their consumption if necessary, based on some sort of a signal. And so those assets do have some flexibility in how they operate. As an example, a hospital typically has more critical assets and fewer curtailable assets, just given its operations, obviously a focus on health and safety. On the other hand, a storage warehouse may have more flexibility. And so segmenting your operational assets between what you consider critical and non-disruptable in any way versus curtailable, and that can help get a feel, think about which assets in your particular business are eligible to provide grid services. The manufacturing plant could have some sort of software controls on site that manage its operations. The most typical example for software controls are BMS systems, so building management systems that control the HVAC on your site. And lastly, there could be EV charging stations out front for employees as they begin to adopt electric vehicles. We know not every facility today has all these things, but you probably have a few of them, and you'll probably increasingly have more. And many of these assets have some inherent form of energy flexibility or grid value that can be taken advantage of. But today, I think for many of those assets, their flexibility is not being fully taken advantage of. And we'll talk about, when we say taking advantage of what, though. So the assets we just talked about can take advantage of a number of different value streams, and I'll walk through some of the more common types that are available in markets. So first, there are wholesale and distribution level value streams. These are value streams derived from the RTO or local utility that will compensate a business for the flexibility in their demand. And so most common across virtually all markets, there are typically three key products: capacity, energy, ancillary services, and I'll quickly walk through each of those. So capacity is what RTOs and utilities use to manage peak demand. So that one time in the summer when everyone's running their air conditioner and usage on the grid is at its peak, the RTO needs to make sure they have enough resources on the system to meet that peak. This is what the capacity market provides. It's a value stream to ensure that there's enough available resources that can meet that, that peak demand whenever it occurs. In the energy market, by comparison, whereas capacity is procuring general availability, which typically happens on a year-long or multi-year time horizon, the energy market is procuring energy in real time to meet actual supply and demand trends, and so that's happening throughout the day. There are auction mechanisms and different ways that the utilities and grid operators procure that, but that's much more on a real-time basis. And then ancillary services are kind of a catch-all for every other product that the grid needs to ensure reliable operations. Things like frequency response or operating reserves in case a large power plant goes down or a transmission line fails. But grids are incentivizing through specific market products and revenue streams everything that they need to ensure a reliable grid. And the value across each of those three products can vary. For some markets, capacity could be more valuable, whereas in others, the ancillary services could be more valuable, and it just depends on the specific dynamics in a given market. And then fourth, we have renewable energy certificates. So this is obviously specific to renewable energy, but every renewable is producing RECs, renewable energy certificates that could be traded or monetized in some way, primarily driven by state RPS goals, but also increasingly, corporate companies are procuring renewable energy for their own sustainability goals, and so there's a growing market that we talked about earlier for voluntary REC purchases, so that those companies can claim that they're being green and procuring the renewable energy to offset their operations. And then next is retail, which we also call on-bill value streams, which means the businesses can take advantage of this or access this value via reductions in their utility bill. And so there are two primary ways that that happens. The first is demand charges, so that can be either local facility peaks, and so managing your local facility peak to reduce your facility demand, or also managing how much you use when the broader grid is at its system peak. And so those are two common types of demand charges that a customer can pay. And then the second big bucket is energy savings. So leveraging your flexibility to shift production from high price times to low price times. The most prominent example being California time of use rates, where they're relatively high, 4 to 9 p.m. in the summer, lower in other parts of the day and year. So it incentivizes when you use your electricity. And then finally, incentives. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but there are a number of state incentives that can be taken advantage of, and then federal incentives, which largely come in the form of tax breaks. And so, this can happen across both front of the meter assets and behind the meter assets. Behind the meter being any sort of asset that is located at a business's facility. And so all of these value streams can typically be accessed for behind the meter, and then the retail component would not apply for front of the meter assets. So that kind of gives a lay of the land for the markets where grid services could apply, the assets, and the value streams. So let's talk about the definition of grid services. Grid services is a relatively new term, but we've thought about it across 3 key dimensions. So the first is flexibility. It's really about converting that inherent flexibility that businesses have through the assets on site into a product that could be used by the market, so whether that's the energy output of a given asset or the flexibility to reduce its demand. The second is optimization. So it's important to understand the cost of that flexibility. So how much does it cost you to charge and discharge that battery? How much does it cost you to turn off that curtailable operational asset you have? And so some resources have higher costs than others to be flexible. And furthermore, by providing the service to the grid, these assets are now visible to the grid operator, which enables the grid operator to manage the system more efficiently. If I know Steve's steel plant can turn off its 100 megawatt arc furnace, I can call on that resource instead of unnecessarily asking another generator to turn on. So it's this optimization across assets that is really valuable. And then finally is monetization. So all this wouldn't really matter if there wasn't financial value to it. And so the flexibility that the energy assets have provides value, and the grid rewards that in one of 2 ways, either by reducing costs or providing revenue to the asset owner. And so grid services is really all about knowing what assets exist, what flexibility they have, and connecting those assets in a given market to a specific value stream. That's the key. And there's a fundamental premise that right now there's underutilized assets at your business that could be providing more grid services than they currently are. Whether that means large-scale renewable project that you have contracted rights for that's not fully monetizing those rights in the markets, or your operational assets that have latent flexibility. It may not be fully incorporating the energy market value. And so taking advantage of all that, connecting those assets to markets, to value streams, that's what we mean when we say grid services. And so we've spoken about assets, markets, and value streams as the 3 pillars of grid services. And so building on the previous slides, we've listed out some common and certainly not exhaustive sets of assets at customer sites, markets where the value can be created, and then specific value streams that can be monetized. And so you could imagine a spaghetti chart drawing lines from assets to markets to value streams, and quickly the whole slide would fill out with possible lines that could be drawn to connect each. So think about, a solar project in PJM may be eligible for ITC, could also participate in the capacity market, energy market, could monetize its RECs, versus a backup generator in ISO New England that may be eligible for the capacity market, energy market, operating reserves, and demand charge management. There's often different value streams that are mutually exclusive. So, for example, participating in the energy market could make you ineligible to provide operating reserves, ancillary services, and then similarly, certain utility programs may exist where there's multiple options. California is a great example. There's DRAM, CBP, and BIP, 3 different demand response programs. You can only do one of them. So there's some mutual exclusivity. There's interrelationships between all of them. And so the key is really understanding how your assets fit into a given market and which value streams make the most sense based on your particular setup. So let's take a specific example just to show what that spaghetti chart might look like and show how complex it can quickly get. So in this example, our asset is a solar plus storage at a particular facility that has a few operational assets it can leverage in Massachusetts, where the ISO is ISO New England, and it's in the national grid utility. And so based on those combination of assets and markets, there are no fewer than 10 different value streams that could be monetized, and we'll kind of quickly walk through each one. So first are the incentive programs. So this, because there's CapEx deployed to install the solar plus storage, it's eligible for ITC benefits. It can access the SMART program in Massachusetts, which is a fixed dollar per kWh value for every kWh of electricity that the system produces. And then also the Clean Peak program in Massachusetts, which is a value stream that incentivizes batteries to charge from solar and wind and then discharge during times of the day when demand is the highest. So those are a few incentive and state level programs that are available. On the wholesale side, there's the capacity market, energy market, ancillary services markets, which we talked about earlier. Here, real-time reserves and forward reserves are actually mutually exclusive. You can't do both. So you got to think about, okay, which one's more valuable? We know the forward reserves market is typically more valuable, but it has more stringent performance requirements. So those are some considerations about which value stream to take advantage of. And then finally, there's distribution and retail level savings. So there's ICAP savings, which is a system level capacity charge, so based on the ISO New England system. And then there's 2 utility programs, which are also mutually exclusive. And we actually forgot facility level demand charge management, so that's not even listed here. So there's actually 11 value streams that could be taken advantage of. But the other key thing to note, like we talked about, is there's an interrelationship between all of these. So as one quick example, participation in some of these will cannibalize your ability to participate in the other. So as an example, if you're participating in the daily dispatch program, that can erode your baseline, which is essentially a measure of how much electricity you normally be using. And so by participating in that, it's going to limit your ability to participate in the ISO New England capacity market. And so it's a really complex set of interactions that you have between the assets and value streams for a given market. And it really takes a lot of deep understanding of the rules and thoughtful analysis about figuring out which value streams make sense. And admittedly, ISO New England is one of the more complex markets, but at the same time, there's no market where there's only 1 or 2 value streams. So this sort of analysis and interdependency and thoughtfulness about which value stream should apply for a given set of projects and how you can make the most money is an important question to answer. And so many people have probably heard about a product market fit, the term, how well does a product fit for a given market demand. So we've adapted that here because it really is all about understanding the product market asset fit. So given all those interdependencies that we just talked about, mutually exclusive options, commingling of value streams, how do you think about where to play? And there's a number of key questions that can help address that. And so for the assets, thinking about when can the assets be flexible, how long can they be curtailed for, what is the cost to curtail? If I can only be flexible in the middle of the night during the spring and fall, that's going to be a different value than if I can be flexible year round. Second, on the market side, so thinking about does a capacity market exist? How volatile are the energy markets? What's the growth rate of renewables? These kind of things will inform your ability to take advantage of certain products. If it's a low volatile, the energy market has little volatility and is low priced, that's not going to be a very attractive market to participate in the energy market compared to, say, Texas or Alberta, where energy market pricing is a little bit higher, there's more volatility, that could provide some opportunities. Same with renewables. The more renewables on the system, that generally leads to more ancillary services needs and associated higher value with those ancillary services products. So those are important considerations to think about. And then finally, on the product or value stream. So understanding, what are the requirements to participate? How much money do I earn? How many times will I need to participate? What are the rules around if I can't participate? Are there penalties? Thinking about your risk tolerance for all of those things is important. And there's general questions about eligibility. If you're thinking about on-bill savings, does your retail rate that you're on support your ability to achieve those savings that could be available? So these are all important questions that need to be answered when you think about fitting a given asset and its inherent flexibility across a certain value stream in a given market. Making sure you're answering these questions and thinking through how they all interrelate to each other is just as important as knowing what exists. But figuring out that product market asset fit is really important, because once you do that, the value of layering on grid services becomes really clear. So this is just a few example markets, some of the big ISOs and RTOs in North America, and showing indicative dollar per megawatt year values. So for any given megawatt, you're seeing at least $100,000 in potential value if you could fully capture the different value streams that are available in those markets. As you can see, there is variability. Ontario is really high because it has a really high capacity charge called the global adjustment. But overall, there's significant revenues that can be achieved, and depending on your costs for flexibility, it can really be a big profit boost to your company. And so just to bring it all together with a specific case study, an example of what it looks like when you do take advantage of grid services and really extract the most value. We took one of our own examples of a project we're currently working on at UMass Boston. And so there we're doing a solar plus storage project with some electric vehicle charging stations. So over a megawatt of solar, a 500 kW, 2 megawatt hour lithium-ion battery system, and then 11 charging stations. And so it was a fully financed solution for UMass Boston, meaning NLX financed it, and we're taking advantage of all the grid services value streams to help pay for that system. The solar is going on a campus building, an 8-story garage. It's a complex engineering build out. And we're really taking advantage of a lot of the revenue streams that we talked about. This is, again, an ISO New England example. But of those 11 value streams, there's probably 6 or 7 that we were able to take advantage. So it's receiving the SMART incentive, which is the Massachusetts solar incentive. It's going to be participating in the capacity market, the forward reserves market on the wholesale side, and then it's going to take advantage of the Clean Peak program, on-bill demand charge management savings, and a couple of Eversource utility programs. And so, all in all, this is, as you can see on the slide, over $1.5 million in energy savings, but that's only achieved by taking advantage of all the different revenue streams that are out there. Some people will look at this and only do a couple, but it's really about layering on as many different value streams as you can and having the right tools in place to fully co-optimize across all of those. So now let's move on to the commercial landscape and what looks like to actually bring this all together and take advantage of grid services. And so there are really three main types of players in the energy landscape. You've got the operators themselves of the programs, so those are the ISOs, the utilities, the RTOs, that are going to offer some sort of products or incentives for to encourage the flexibility and get the outcomes they desire. You have the energy consumers on the other side who have assets on site. There's typically some latent flexibility, but commonly they don't have full-scale energy teams thinking about this every day. They don't have the internal resourcing, and so that's really where energy solution providers come in as a conduit to connect those energy market programs with the energy consumers, and they'll bring that expertise. This is all they do is think about on a daily basis, how do I connect the energy consumers to the energy market programs and really help enable that transition of the grid that we've been talking about. And so to fully take advantage of grid services, and typically this is the role that the energy solution provider can play, there are four key pillars of success to maximize that opportunity. So the first is on the regulatory side. So as mentioned, the energy markets are regulated markets. The rules are complex. They're, as much as we want to try to minimize changes, they do change. And so it's super important to stay up to speed on the latest regulatory developments, know what's coming down the pipe, and most importantly, understanding how those different regulatory outcomes can make a given project or monetizing assets more or less attractive. And so the second is energy market experts. So making sure, the key to connecting all those dots and ensuring the right asset market value stream fit is to take that understanding of the regulatory market and apply it to a commercial model that's able to take advantage of those constructs in the energy markets in a way that actually makes money. So it's critical to have a team of people who really understand the ins and outs of the markets and how the different assets can participate, and truly understanding the relative value of each revenue stream and being able to connect all those assets to those markets. Third is dedicated operational teams. So, you can have the first two, and you can even have technology as well, but if you don't have the teams that are there to make it all come together and pull it off, it's all for naught. So these are the operational teams that will help a business execute on, bringing that flexibility to market, coming up with plans to reduce energy consumption, and just kind of bringing all the pieces together. And then finally is technology. So, given the digitalization in the energy markets, the digitalization of assets, technology plays an increasingly important role. And we'll just quickly use the next slide to walk through an example of what we mean by this. So here's a great example of how technology can be leveraged to help monetize assets in the market. So this is actually something we pulled from our own optimization software that controls a couple of different assets across a few different value streams in New York, I believe, is where this particular example is coming from. And so because this is all one facility, it's critical to view these assets in an aggregation and looking at them cohesively instead of looking at each individual one in a vacuum. So you can really co-optimize across everything. And so to quickly orient, the dotted black line at the top is what the facility load would have been absent any distributed energy resources. And then the dark blue line is actual facility demand, taking into account the different assets on site. And so it's combining solar production, fuel cell, battery storage systems. It's taking advantage, it knows what value exists at a given point in time. So those are the two graphs on the bottom, is how valuable a dollar per kW and dollar per kWh is across the day. And so you can see highlighted here certain times where it's taking, the software is recognizing the value of what the grid is offering and doing energy market arbitrage, demand charge management, while also incorporating other on-site requirements like export constraints. And so it's bringing all this together in a technology solution that, frankly, would be virtually impossible to manage manually or without technology. And so that's why technology plays such a critical role when accessing grid services to help bring this all together in a way that's scalable and to manage the interdependency across value streams in a sophisticated way. So that concludes the webinar, and we'll close with a few final thoughts. So we've talked about a lot today, and I'll summarize what we've talked about into a few key takeaways. So first, shareholders, employees, customers, your competition increasingly care about how you operate your business. More and more businesses are participating in the energy transition. You probably already are, and if you're not, you soon will be. 3, there are new opportunities to leverage your business's energy assets to provide services to the grid. The grid is becoming more decentralized, and many assets have some form of flexibility in them that can be taken advantage of and use that to either reduce costs or earn revenues. And 4th, it's important to understand, can't emphasize this enough, how your assets connect to specific markets and specific value streams. So it's all about that asset, market, product, or value stream fit, and ensuring that you're co-optimizing across the right value streams based on the specific assets that you have. And then finally, the landscape is complex and it's constantly changing. The rules can get pretty wonky, but if you have the right tools in place, if you have the right partners in place, the opportunities exist, and it's definitely something worth taking advantage of. And so to close it out, ultimately, why does any of this matter? As we discussed at the very beginning, there are trends towards electrification, trends towards decarbonization, decentralization. We know we need to aggressively move to an electricity market model based on flexible loads, renewables, batteries, just given those trends that are happening. And so grid services are really a central component to enabling that and ultimately helping us achieve the transition to sustainable energy. The more grid services your assets can provide, whether that's on-site assets, renewables, batteries, electric vehicles, in whatever markets you own assets in, the more value streams you can take advantage of where that product, asset, market fit makes sense, the more harmonious the grid will work together across supply and demand, and the faster we'll get to that sustainable energy transition that we need to be at. So let's do it. With that, I'll conclude the body of the webinar, turn it back over to Jessica for some questions from the audience. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone who has submitted questions during today's event. Remember, if Steve does not get a chance to answer your question, he or a member from his team at NLX will follow up with you as soon as possible. So let's get started. Steve, how can you finance a storage project when the grid services compensation rules are changed every few years?
Thanks, Jessica. And yeah, it's a great question. I think, as much as we advocate for certainty in the markets, from an investment perspective, the reality is the grids are catching up to everything we talked about in this presentation, and so the rules do change. The way we think about it, and I think the way a lot of people in the industry think about it, are concept of merchant revenue, which are revenue streams and cash flows that are not guaranteed versus non-merchant or contracted revenues. So that distinction is important. And so to the extent you're thinking about investing or financing a storage project, and you're heavily exposed to merchant revenues, you'd probably want to require a higher investment return, all else equal. I can tell you, at Enel at least, as an example, we're fairly comfortable underwriting merchant revenue streams given our familiarity with the markets. We have our own internal views on how solid certain revenue streams and cash flows are. And then probably one of the most important things, kind of what we talked about earlier around the 4 pillars of what we view as what you need to be successful to operate in grid services, is a fairly significant engagement on the regulatory side, to make sure you're kind of staying up to speed on what's changing, when those changes are expected to occur, and ultimately advocating for to make sure that to the extent there's as little disruption as possible, so you don't find yourself upside down on an investment. And I think we've largely been successful on that to date. But I think so overall, it's really a combination of being deeply entrenched in the markets, appropriately setting return thresholds, and then I guess I'd also say there are many options for financed or no capex solutions where businesses can get the advantages of a storage system without the initial upfront investment dollars. So that's an option as well to help mitigate that concern.
Thank you, Steve, for that detailed explanation. This next question is about batteries. When are batteries economical to shift coincident peak demand?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I guess the part of the way I would answer that is it really goes back to that product market value stream fit equation that we talked about earlier, and understanding the interdependencies across different value streams. So, as an example, in some markets, the coincident peak demand of the system, there's some ability to predict it based on temperature. The ISO or RTO will give a forecast, and so you can know when those system peaks are likely to occur. They occur over a relatively small number of hours. That could be something where a battery could handle that. I think in other markets, it could either be more difficult to predict. Ontario is a great example of that, where there's a lot of different assets chasing those peaks, which then actually shift a peak. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to predict when those peaks are going to occur. Or you could be evaluated over a longer number of hours. New York's a good example of that. And those combination of things can make it more difficult to maximize the value of peak shifting. And so I think the other part of this, though, is it's also important to think about the value that you're getting from any given activity, and this, as it relates to this question, coincident peak shifting, but really understanding how much you're earning and what are you giving up, if anything. So, if you're frequently discharging in the summer to try to mitigate a peak, does that have adverse or unintended consequences about potentially cannibalizing your ability to participate in other value streams, like, say, the capacity market? And so, overall, it's not a straightforward answer. It really needs to be evaluated along that kind of product market value stream fit, and relative to the actual capabilities of the asset.
Okay, Steve. So when it comes to evaluating grid services, what are the key metrics that you need to think about?
It's a good question. Obviously there are a lot of, I'd say there are a lot of different ways to think about, grid services and metrics that you could track. I think ultimately and this is the mental model we use at an LX, it all boils down to, I think two key metrics. The first is, $1 per dispatch, or $1 per each time the asset's utilized. How much are you actually earning to curtail or provide that flexibility to the grid? And so there could be a big dollar value out there, but if it takes a significant number of dispatches to earn that, or a significant amount of time that the asset's being utilized, wherein it's not doing other things that are, generally core to a business's operation, that may be less worthwhile if you could potentially earn, 80% of that value through 10 or 20% of the effort. And so I think that's probably the first key metric, is the dollar earned, and normalizing that in some way across number of dispatches or time, the amount of time the asset will be utilized to earn that value. And then similarly thinking about the cost. So, both direct costs of, if you have a battery, what are the fuel costs to discharge? If you have a generator, what are the fuel costs? And then indirect opportunity costs by, if you're participating in this value stream, what does that mean about, ability to, or lack thereof, to participate in others? And so I think it's really the combination of those two, the dollars per cost and then a normalization factor, that gets you your net value from grid services. And I think generally that's a good way to think about it. It doesn't really make sense to try to dive in deep on every little case-by-case analysis, and there's typically some good proxies out there that can be provided on total value available and what it'll take to earn that value.
I want to thank our audience again for continuing to submit questions during our Q&A session. This is probably the last question we will be able to get to today. So, how do energy as a service models differ from energy performance contracting models?
Yeah, I could answer that by just talking about the different business models or the typical business models that are out there. There are probably two key ways to think about or segment what those business models look like. The first, being what's more common and traditional, where you're taking advantage of an existing asset that a business has and leveraging that in the energy markets. And so, there the most common model is really a revenue share, where the business earns a percentage of the total revenue derived from their flexibility, and a third party, typically a demand side aggregator, will earn the remainder. And so that aligns incentives to really maximize the value of that asset. And then similarly, or secondarily, I would say, if you're thinking about a net new asset and bringing, say a battery on, a solar plus storage system on, and what does that look like? And I think commonly, outright payment and upfront cash aside that the business would be investing. For finance solutions, there are a number of different models out there, but two probably key ones as it relates to working with a third party to incorporate grid services for that asset. Similar to the existing asset, there's a shared savings model. This is probably one of the more common models, where you take all the value derived across all different value streams from that asset and then share the total pool of dollars with the business. And so it's a no upfront, cash model, and they derive some of the, take part in some of the savings that are achieved. And then the second would be kind of a lease model or an energy as a service model, really where this is just paying a recurring fee over time for access to the asset and the value it's deriving. So it's more of a steady state fee that's being paid out for that service. So I think I know Jessica said that's it. Just wanted to thank everybody for the time today, and I really appreciate you spending the time to learn more about grid services. Thanks.
Steve, I really appreciate you taking the time to answer all of the questions today, and I'm sure that your team will follow up with the rest of the people who submitted questions as soon as they can. As always, thank you to everyone who was able to jump online with us today for the live event. Thank you to those who will be watching the archived version, and a large thank you to the team at NLX North America for all the work you put into today's presentation. It is always a pleasure to work with your team. We hope everyone has a safe and healthy rest of your day. This concludes today's webinar.